All right, well, in case you didn't hear or get a sheet, we're in James chapter 4, if you're not already over there. And tonight we're going to be talking about mainly quarrels and conflicts, of course some other things along those same lines. But question number one on our handout, the question is, what do people most commonly fight about?
In church or in life?
I think that's a really
Well, that was just a general question. I mean,
It matters stuff that don't matter.
okay. And you would say money? Yeah, money.
Feelings.
Okay, maybe somebody has hurt feelings. Anything else come to mind? Power? Yeah, definitely a struggle for power. That's probably true, yeah. I think generally probably if it's existed in the world, it's probably been fought over, hasn't it? And I think probably the most common things are, to me, it is money and possessions. You know, when I think about quarrels and conflicts today that arise between people, that's generally the bottom line of it. And of course, there are conflicts over other people too, aren't there? There's conflicts over, husbands and wives and children and parents and things like that. So there's a number of things that people fight over today. And tonight we're going to talk about or study about in James chapter 4 the cause of these conflicts and quarrels that arise not only within the world but also within the church itself. Let's go, if you're not over there, to James chapter 4, and if I can get a volunteer, somebody read the first 6 verses for us.
From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence even of your lust that war in your members? Ye lust and have not, ye kill and desire to have, and cannot obtain. Ye fight and war, yet ye have not, because ye ask not. Ye ask and receive not, because ye ask amiss, that ye may consume it upon your own lust. Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is an enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is an enemy of God. Do you think that the Scripture saith in vain, the Spirit that dwelleth within us lusteth to envy? But he giveth more grace, wherefore he said, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble.
Okay, so we talked just a little bit about what people in general fight about, but what is really the root of all these fights and these conflicts and these quarrels between people?
Our own lust.
Okay, the word lust or desire is mentioned there, and what are we talking about whenever we talk about lust or desire?
Usually wanting something that we don't have.
Okay, wanting something that we don't have. What else would you include within that?
It boils down to selfishness, doesn't it?
It really does, doesn't it? I mean, when you think about it, it's what I want, isn't it? So because I want this, my desire or my lust is this, I'm going to create a conflict, or there's going to be a conflict between you and me. Now, again, it could be money, it could be possessions, it could be other people, number of things that were mentioned here tonight. But where do wars and conflicts come? Well, basically it comes from people wanting their own way. Wanting to be number one or wanting to be put on top of everything. And that's true in the world. It's also true within the church itself. When we think about the idea of what we want, lust or desire as it's described here, is all lust or desire bad? No. What determines if something is bad or good?
It's worldly.
Okay?
Yeah, it's not godly.
Yeah, basically God's definition, right? So God says, these things are bad if you want them, if you desire them, these things are good. And like Chase said, generally speaking, those things that are bad for us are worldly by moral standards, and the things that are good for us are spiritual in nature. A lot of times, I think, we've talked about the idea before how God has created us with this soul longing desire to seek something higher than us. And God just made us that way so that we can never be fully satisfied unless we seek Him and do His will. And because of that hole, if you will, that's in our soul, that void that we try to fill, a lot of times people try to fill that with material things, don't they? Well, what happens when that doesn't work?
The next material thing.
Yeah, it's really a frustrating cycle, isn't it? Because people think, well, if I do this or I get this, I'm going to be full, I'm going to be happy. But that's not the way material things work. I mean, is everybody here tonight, are they just, there's nothing in life that they want? Nothing that you desire, right? You got everything that you could ever imagine. Well, there's always something more, isn't there? There's always something bigger. There's always something better. There's always another thing that you want to add to your collection. And those things, aren't necessarily sinful in and of themselves, but if we're trying to use those things to fill that void in our soul, it's not going to work. And so we have to understand that people can get frustrated, when they start looking for satisfaction in these physical areas and they're not finding it. The more that they get, they're not finding it. Then I think it really only magnifies that desire that they have within their heart and magnifies the intensity of them to fulfill that desire. And so God has created this desire within us that's spiritual, and it can't be satisfied by material things. But people think it can, don't they? And so a lot of quarrels and a lot of conflicts today revolve around this idea, well, if I get this, then I'm going to be satisfied or I'm going to be happy. Number 3 here, what do we usually want from God in times of prayer? Okay, and generally speaking, now this may not be true in every instance, but generally speaking, would you say that a lot of those prayers are selfish in nature? Yeah, I think a lot of times when we think about prayer, we kind of think about it as a way to get from God what we want, and that's not really the reason God designed it. Now, it's a way for us to make our petitions known to Him. It's a way for us to petition God's help in accomplishing His will. But a lot of times I think our prayers are selfish in nature. And that's kind of what James is writing about here in verse 3. He says, you ask and do not receive because you ask amiss that you may spend it on your pleasures. And so in other words, it's this idea of asking God to do something for me for my benefit. This idea of selfishness, maybe, if you will. And so a lot of times when we approach God in prayer, it's to supply some want or to meet some need that we have. And sometimes those prayers, if we're not careful, can become just simply selfish in nature. But it is interesting that in verse 2 there, he talks about this desire that people have, this want or that they have for their lust or their desire to be fulfilled. And so he talks about in verse 2 there that some desire and they don't have it because they simply do little to accomplish it. Some people want things in life and they're not willing to do anything to get it. They do little to think about it. They do little to plan about it. They do little to work to make it happen. And so we can desire and not have. He also talks about there in verse 2, some people desire stuff, they want stuff, and they lie and they cheat and they steal and they kill in order to accomplish it, in order to get it. Then he also mentions there in verse 2, some people want things and they start quarrels or they start conflicts in order to fulfill their want or their desire. And then in verse 3 there, you have people who want and they ask God, but they don't receive it because they're simply asking for it for selfish purposes. And so the bottom line in the idea of this quarrels and this conflicts is the idea of selfishness. And of course, we don't get the things that we ask from God by being selfish, do we? Is God going to answer a selfish prayer? No. We need to understand that we get the things that we ask from God, number one, because they're in accordance with His will. But number two, what should we be thinking of the things that we ask in prayer? How they're going to benefit me?
It should be spiritual in nature, mainly looking out for the welfare of those around us.
Yeah. So really, it's the idea or the principle of how are these things going to glorify God, right? Not how are they going to personally benefit me and help me in life, but how are they going to bring glory to God? How are they going to further the church? How are they going to help somebody else who's in need? And so we have to think about those things when we ask in prayer. And I think we have to be careful that we don't become selfish in the prayers that we pray to God. So a good thing I think to do would be whenever we ask God for something, to ask ourselves the question, what's my purpose in asking for this? Why do I want this to be accomplished? Is it for me? So I can go out and consume this with my own wants and desires and lusts? Or is there a greater and more noble purpose in mind? Number 4 here. So what does the friendship of the world do to our relationship with God? That's basically what we're talking about, this idea of selfishness, of wanting and desiring these things. So if we want to be friends with the world, what's that going to do with our relationship to God?
Separate.
Yeah, and how does he define it there? Or how does he describe it?
Enmity.
Okay, it's enmity. And what else? There's a couple other terms that are used there. Yeah, it certainly does make ourselves God's enemy. I'm looking there in verse 4, though, those first 2 terms, adulterers and adulteresses. That's an interesting way to describe somebody who's bent on their desire and their want is for worldly things. In God's eyes, that person is guilty of spiritual adultery. And so when you think of it from that standpoint, there's a lot of ways in the Bible, or I don't know ways, maybe relationships that are illustrated to us in the Bible that are physical in nature to help us better understand a spiritual relationship. For instance, in the church, we're called a family. Well, that helps us to better understand our relationship to one another and to God. And it's interesting that the Bible, where God, through His infinite wisdom, depicted the relationship of marriage to describe our relationship with Him. Because generally, when you think about the relationship of marriage, what type of a relationship is marriage?
Spiritual.
Okay, certainly spiritual part to it. Yeah, would you say it's probably the closest relationship that you'll have on earth? I mean, the most intimate? I would say it is. There's probably nobody who knows us better than our spouse. And so God describes this very close relationship, or uses this very close, this very intimate physical relationship to help us better understand our relationship to Him. And so we have this commitment to God. We're the bride of Christ. We're the wife of Christ. That's the church. And when we start pursuing worldly things and turn away our attention from pursuing God, that's spiritual adultery, isn't it? So we're being unfaithful to God. And certainly it's not going to help our relationship or help us get our prayers answered in any way. But to live for this world is to be unfaithful to God. That's basically what's being stated there. And so if our desire, our wants and our desire is for all these material things and we're selfish in nature, then we're in essence going against our commitment that we've made to God. Question number 5 here. Why does God oppose people who are proud? It talks about in verse 6 there that he gives more grace. He resists the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. So why does He resist those people who are proud?
Because they no longer believe they need God's love to get accomplished the things in life that they should be accomplishing to please Him.
Yes. there's a lot of characteristics that come along with a person who is a proud person. And the Bible describes it in a number of different ways. Stiff-necked is one of those ways that the Bible describes it. Obstinate, rebellious. A person who is proud do they need God's help?
They do really, but they don't believe.
Yeah, they don't believe they do, and they're certainly not going to ask for it, and they're not going to pretend that they need anybody's help. Too proud to do that. And so, for a person to act in that way, it's not going to attain the favor of God. God has to make a stand against certain people, and the the love of God is shown to us in so many different ways. But God has to draw a line somewhere and say, listen, if you're going to act like this and you're going to live like this, I can't do this for you. And that's one of the things that the Bible talks about. Those who are full of pride, those who are obstinate, those who are rebellious, those who are stubborn. If they ask God for something, is God going to give it to them? No, he's got to draw the line somewhere, doesn't he? And he's got to at least point to this idea that he can't do something to help encourage their thinking or to encourage their living. And so he's going to oppose those who are proud. Question number 6. So when does God give us grace? Gives us resistance if we're proud. So when do we get grace? Yes, when we possess humility. When we talk about grace, what is grace? Let's just start there.
Unmerited favor.
Yeah, unmerited favor. That's kind of the standard definition, I think, that we talk about. But that means we don't deserve it. In other words, God's giving us some benefit, or God's doing us some favor, and we've done nothing to deserve this favor or this benefit that God has given to us. So, who does God give grace to? Those who are humble. And a person who turns to God for help, whether it be for advice, for direction, a person who trusts God enough to do what He says, then the Bible teaches this principle, and we're going to talk about it. He expounds upon it a little bit later, but it's not just grace, but it's all the grace you'll ever need and then some. That's how much humility means to God. And so if we're going to be this proud, obstinate, rebellious person and live selfishly and, ask for things selfishly, God has to oppose us. But if we're going to turn to God to help, if we're going to humble ourselves, if we're going to seek His will and turn to His advice, then God's going to give us things that we have no business getting. He's going to give us blessings and things that we just don't simply deserve in this life. All right, anybody have any comments or questions? Let's go to verse 7 here. Somebody read verses 7 through 12 for us in James 4.
Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, and ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Be afflicted and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to heaviness. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He shall lift you up. Speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother and judgeth his brother speaketh evil of the law and judgeth the law. But if thou judge the law, thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who art thou that judgest another?
Okay, if you kind of remember the context in James chapter 1, the idea of trials. Our faith being proved, our faith being put to test. And what you have through the book of James is, these series of tests. Here's a test. Prove your loyalty to God. Are you doing this? Are you not doing this? Pride and humility are one of those things that of course have come up in the discussion here. And we talked a little bit about humility and kind of defined it, but in question number 7 here, it says, how does James describe the way that we should come to God? And he's really describing the idea of humility, right? So what is required? Submission, right? He says first, submit ourselves to God. That word submit, actually the word submit, and then it says resist the devil. That word submit and resist in the Greek are both military terms, and that's kind of interesting because basically it's this idea of do what the master says. Turn to God. And of course, if we're going to do that, who do we have to resist? Yeah, that means we have to go against Satan, don't we? We have to stand against him and oppose him. So how are we going to get close to God? Verse 8 there.
You have to leave from it.
Okay? And what's required in that? 2 things that he mentions there.
Clean your hands and purify your hearts.
Yeah, clean hands and pure hearts. What does that mean?
Dirt off of you. The world, wash the world off of you.
Okay? Hands are actions, right? So we have to be clean in the action. We can't go out here and live a wicked and immoral life and draw close to God. We have to cleanse our hands and we have to purify our hearts. What does that mean? Yeah, it's the inward man, right? It's not just about the outward actions. The inward has to be pure too. And so if we want to get close to God, those are things that are required. God has a standard. He has laws that we have to live by. And so we can't just go out here and live like we want and think that we're going to be close to God. We have to meet that standard and to operate on His level in order to receive those blessings and be humble in His sight. What does he mention there in verse 9? What else is required?
I think it's a kind of a coming together with other people that are Christians and those that are weeping, then we're to weep with them. If they're, if we just need to adjust our attitude to whatever the situation calls us to do to encourage others to rely on the Word of God.
Yeah, and the Bible teaches us the Christian life is more than just about us, is it? It's not just about how things in this world affect us, it's about how it affects others too. And how do we feel and how do we react because of that? And, the bottom line there throughout verse 9 is the idea of mourning and weeping. And it's not that you have to go around, with this just constantly being sad, but I think what he's talking about is be deeply affected by sin. Can we get close to God if sin doesn't bother us? No. I mean, we have to have, when sin enters into the picture, we have to have regret, we have to have remorse. So the idea of mourning and tears is certainly present there. And those are all things that again, show humility in the presence of God. Submission to God, resisting the devil, a pure heart, pure hands, clean hands, and then being deeply mourned or affected by sin itself. So question number 8 is, how does the devil react if a person resists him? First of all, the word resist, I mentioned it a while ago, it's a military term, but it means to make a stand or to stand against. And the idea is you exert some power. I mean, you exert some energy. If we're going to resist Satan, does it take effort?
Yes.
Yeah, it's not going to happen by accident. I mean, we're not going to fall into it. So we have to exert some energy. We have to put forth some effort if we want to resist the advances of Satan. And how do we do that? How do we resist Satan?
Give the devil no place.
Yeah, that's a good one, isn't it? Give no place to the devil. What does that mean?
Don't let him in.
what is that, Ephesians 5:29, something like that. So,
Yeah, it starts in Ephesians 4:23.
okay.
So along in this, there are things, how to renew our spirit in God's word.
Yeah. And in the particular context, of course, he's talking about anger, isn't he? He says, be angry and sin not. You know, don't let the sun go down upon your wrath. Don't give place to the devil. In other words, don't give Satan an opportunity. And anger is one of those powerful emotions that Satan can take advantage of us when we're angry, can't he? He can certainly, we can certainly present an opportunity to tempt us to sin.
That's when we're weak.
Yes. So, certainly not giving Satan an opportunity. What else would you say? What's the best way to resist Satan? Okay, that's a good one, isn't it? If we submit ourselves to God, are we going to have any problem resisting Satan? No. I was thinking about the temptation of Christ. You remember when Jesus was personally tempted by Satan in Luke chapter 4? And of course, there were three different appeals that Satan made to Christ. But how did Christ resist Satan? What helped him? Yeah. Every time that Satan asks him about something or tempts him to do something, he says, well, it is written. You know? And so he gave us a pretty good pattern or a pretty good example of how we can resist Satan. Think about, and if we would do this more, it would be helpful. But have you ever been in a situation where you've been tempted to sin? And you start thinking about God, and you start thinking about what His Word says, how it says, don't do this. Well, that's what Jesus did. You know, He's bringing to mind this, thinking about it over and over and over again. And that's powerful when you do that. It is. You remember the example of Joseph in the Old Testament in Genesis 39, where Potiphar's wife tries to get Joseph to sleep with her? And he says, he talks about how he couldn't betray Potiphar, but he also says, I think it's in verse 9 there, he says, how can I do this great evil and sin against my God? So what helped him to resist that temptation? It was thinking about God and His will, wasn't it? How can I break God's will? When God has so clearly commanded me this, how can I go against it and violate His will? And so we have the example in the scripture, whenever we're tempted to sin, think about God, think about what His Word says, and think about it over and over and over again. And that's one of the most powerful ways, I think, that of course, we can resist Satan. There's other things, like Steve pointed out. Don't give Satan an opportunity. Don't go somewhere you're not supposed to be. Don't be around stuff you're not supposed to be around, things like that. But certainly resisting Satan is something that God expects us to do if we want to receive grace. Now, let's talk about this idea. So what happens when we do that? What happens when we think about God and we think about His Word over and over again and we resist the temptations of Satan? Yeah, he's not going to, Satan is smart enough, he's not going to waste time, right? His goal is to destroy mankind, and that's how he thinks he can get back at God. But his goal is to destroy mankind. He wants to destroy all of mankind. So, is he going to waste time with a person who's going to resist him?
Well, he shouldn't, but it does seem like as a Christian, sometimes you do have a bigger target on you than people that's easily persuaded to go along with whatever the world may want you to do.
Yeah, and I don't think this is a statement that he's going to run away and never come back. He'll go away for the time, won't he? But he'll be back. But when you think about how do you resist temptation? Is it easier for a person to resist temptation who's never done it before versus a person who's, built up an immunity, so to speak, against it? Which one's easier?
Repetition.
When you think about what's the hardest time to do something?
What's scary is to do something for the first
Yeah.
Because you don't know what you're doing or how to do it or how it's going to all shake out.
Yeah, I think that's just a general principle and idea. Usually the first time you do something is the hardest. Now, the next time you've done it, you've experienced it a little bit, you know a little bit about it, and I don't think it's any different with Satan. And it's not to say that Satan will never appeal to us, but if you never resist the temptation, I mean, just common sense is never going to happen, is it? And so the hardest time is the first, and the more you do it, the easier it is to say no. Doesn't mean it won't ever appeal to you again, but that's just the bottom line of it. And so when you think about resisting Satan, if we submit to God, if we do exactly what our military commander says, are we going to win? Are we going to be victorious? And that's what it means there. God's going to lift you up in victory. If we'll follow the commander, then we're going to win. We're going to be victorious. But we have to submit ourselves to God in order to do that. Well, I guess we're out of time. I didn't expect to run out that quickly, but we're going to have to stop there. Does anybody have any other thoughts? If you read the rest of the chapter, basically a warning not to speak evil against one another, and then really also a warning about the frailty of life. The temptation is to think that we're invincible, that we're going to live forever, that tomorrow is going to be within our control. But we have to be careful as Christians not to think that way, because that's not going to put us in the right frame of mind and not going to put us in the right actions to be pleasing to God. Anybody have any thoughts or comments or anything before we end?
I think a lot of times all of us as individuals have a certain thing that we can say to ourselves, as you mentioned, condition ourselves to resist the devil, to resist temptation, to resist sin. And I think for me, it's just if I say, if the Lord will.
Yeah.
Is this His will that I do this or that? And I don't know, that gives me personally, it makes me feel more humble to the fact that I can do His will easier and not be, thinking, I can take care of this all by myself.
Yeah, and generally, when we think about, that type of attitude, it's an attitude of humility, because we recognize God's the one in control, right? And so when we say if the Lord wills, what we're doing is we're thinking with God in the picture. And we get into trouble when we take God out of the picture and say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And that's really, I think, latter part there, that's what James is talking about. So, all right, we're going to have to wind down for tonight.